Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of our webinar series, Mastering the Arts of Scientific Publication. I'm Carlos Toro. I'm the managing editor of two ACS publications, Chemistry of Materials and ACS Photonics. And we are delighted that you can join us today for part two of this webinar series. If you joined us for part one, welcome again. If you are tuning for the first time, then I would like to remind you that part one of this webinar series was about a couple of weeks ago, where Professor Prashant Kamath, deputy editor of Journal of Physical Chemistry Letter, covered some of the most basic items when it comes to preparing a manuscript for publication, how to really convey your story in a concise way and that is appealing for a broad audience. Today, Professor Jillian Buriak is going to cover a different aspect of preparing a manuscript for publication. She's going to focus on how to make your paper look appealing, how to prepare an effective table of content image, how to make your figures appealing. But before we jump right into the webinar, I would like to go through some of the housekeeping items. So by now, if you've logged into the webcast site, you should be seeing at the bottom of your screen 5 widgets. The one to your left, the yellow one, is the slide area. So pretty much you can toggle on and off the slides that Jillian is going to be using today throughout her presentation. The second widget is the Q&A widget. So that's where you would be able to submit your questions throughout the presentation. And also, if you have any technical problem, our team will be able to assist you. The third widget is the speaker information. And so today our speaker is, as I mentioned, Professor Jillian Buriak. She's the Canada Research Chair of Nanotechnology. She's the Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry of Materials. And you can see the information there. Her research interests span over a wide variety of fields, with particular emphasis in nanotechnology applications for new materials and interfaces. The fourth widget is content that is available to you throughout this webinar. What I would like to remind you of is that if by any chance you would like to get access to the journal portfolio of ACS, we are providing you with a promo code that you can use to access these articles for free within the next 15 days. Also, it is important to remind you that this webinar series has been put together as a follow-up of a virtual issue that came out late last year, covering most of tips from editors on how to improve and how to make your article effective. All the virtual issue, it's called Mastering the Science of Scientific Publication. It has 20 editorials. All of those are available for free. And also I would like to bring to your attention that ACS CanWork is the platform that ACS is using to handle part of the manuscript workflow, but at the same time, ACS CanWorks offer our authors an English editing service. For those of you that are joining us from abroad and outside US, ACS is delighted to offer this service to our authors. And the last widget, it's a help page, and throughout the presentation you can find quick answers to any problem that you can experience throughout the webinar. It is important to remind you that this webinar today, part 2, and the whole series is brought to you by the Publications Division of the American Chemical Society, as well as ACS at Kenwork. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Jillian Buriak, Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry of Materials. And again, she will be covering important topics that usually we tend to overlook when it comes to prepare our manuscripts. So just give you great tips on how to make your paper more appealing. And with that, I will turn it over to Jillian. Jillian?
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the very kind invitation and introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is part 2 of Mastering the Art of Scientific Publication. My name is Jillian Buriak. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry Materials. And while you're on this page, please follow us on Chemistry Materials, our Twitter handle, @ChemMatter. We tweet daily about issues not only in chemistry materials, but also in chemistry and science in general. So this follows up on the wonderful presentation that was made by Prashant Kamat on February the 18th, and it's archived. You can find it here. So if you want to watch his presentation, there it is. Here's the link. So today we're talking about the part of mastering the art of scientific publication that is perhaps more art. And so let's begin. So this follows up, as Carlos mentioned, on a virtual issue that came out in late 2014 called Mastering the Art of Scientific Publication. And what we did is we assembled 20 papers, these were mostly editorials, on different aspects of publishing your papers, dealing with everything from how to start writing, and then how to finish writing, how to do beautiful figures, all the different aspects, how to write a cover letter. So please do have a look. It was Prashant who came up, I think, with the brilliant title of 20 Papers with 2020 Vision on Publishing. So to get on with today, so Prashant, when he did his presentation in mid-February, he was talking about how to write the paper, basically how to put the body of the paper together. And so I'm starting from that point. I'm assuming that at this point you have a draft that is pretty complete. I mean, when you're writing a paper, oftentimes you think you're finished and you may have to go back into the lab and do an experiment or two, but I'm assuming that your draft is complete. Now, a lot of work has gone into writing your draft, doing all the research, obviously, and it's so tempting to say, okay, I'm almost done. But really, you still have work to do because it's really important to present a clean and organized paper that people will want to read and to cite. And so it's important to think about presenting a well-organized and well-structured paper. So please remember that readers and reviewers, because they're the first people who are going to read your paper, that they're human. These are human beings. And we all are built in a way that well, sometimes we will look at a paper and the first impressions that we get from that paper can really dictate how we see it. So if you submit a carefully executed and well-presented paper, people might then assume that, well, I think that this paper may have some carefully executed and well-done science. And so you can see the opposite. If your paper is not carefully presented, people may say, well, why would I assume that the science is well executed? And that's not the foot you want to start on when you are submitting a paper. You want your readers to be able to understand your science very quickly and to not be distracted by poor writing and sloppy figures. Because again, human nature, people may assume that poor writing and sloppy figures means sloppy science. And you don't want anyone to think that, particularly if you put in months or years of your effort, blood, sweat, and tears into making that research a reality. That's the last thing you want anyone to assume. So there's 4 topics that will be covered today. And so the first one is 4 tests for your table of contents image, and by corollary, your title as well. And then how to maximize the longevity of your research. You want your research to have a long impact on future science and even future generations of scientists. So how can you maximize the longevity and long-term impact of your research? I'll tell you about some common graphical errors and how to correct them, and then how to decide what citations to include. These are the 4 things we'll cover today. Okay, so first thing, your table of contents image. Now the table of contents image can often seem like an annoying last-minute thing that you need to do. Your paper is done, it's this beautiful thing, and you say, I just want to press submit. Do I really need to come up with a nice table of contents image? Well, let me remind you of 3 cliches that exist in the English language. So, one, we are told constantly, do not judge a book by the cover. And the reason we are told this all the time is because we do. We do. That is the way humans are built. We judge books by the cover all the time. And of course, you don't want that to cloud your judgment too much, which is why we remind people, we remind our children, we remind people of this. But this is just something we do. And so it's important that you want to start off on the right foot. We also remind people, at least another cliche from the English language, is that first impressions matter. And then the third cliche is that pictures speak 1,000 words. And so there's even this Bo Diddley song of, you can't judge a book by the cover. But we can't help it. We do all the time. And so when I look at these two table of contents images that were published in the most recent issue of Chemistry Materials, I think that they do a beautiful job of very simply and very succinctly and very beautifully presenting the research and making me as a reader say, wow, I want to click on that, I want to read that, I want to learn more. So in this one particular is dealing with flexible electronics, and this other one which is clearly dealing with the surface chemistry issue. But very simple, very clearly presented. And that can make a huge difference. Because you have to remember that all of us are really busy. Everyone is busy. All of you who are here who are spending an hour of your time, for which I'm really grateful, you are all busy. We are constantly bombarded. We have our cell phones that are distracting us. We have committee duties. We've got teaching duties. We've got research. We are constantly distracted. And so people are not going to spend the time downloading a paper if it doesn't interest them. So you have to make potential readers interested. So there are 2 editorials that I wrote. One was this one. The first one, summarize your work in 100 milliseconds or less. This was published in ACS Nano. And the point is that as these busy people are scanning table of contents images, that basically they're making a decision in 100 milliseconds whether to click on your paper and download it and read it and cite it or not. And so that table of contents image, along with the title, has a very profound influence on whether people read your paper, because that's what often drives people to click on your paper. So if you have taken the time to do a very clean and attractive and interesting image, there's a very good chance that people will want to read it. And that's important for the longevity of your research. And then the second editorial, title and table of contents images, the candy store analogy. This is a more recent editorial that came out in Chemistry Materials. And the idea is that if you're reading table of contents images, or table of contents, is that it's kind of like being a kid in a candy store. You have so many choices, you can't pick everything, you simply don't have time. How do you choose? And the table of contents image can have a profound influence on what people do choose. So it's very important. So a good table of contents image, it's probably not very hard to extrapolate as to what would be good. It's clean and easy to read. It can be understood very quickly. And it's insightful with respect to your science. What do you think is the interesting core piece or important item that you are trying to educate your readers about? What did you learn from your research, and what are you going to teach your readers? What is most interesting? And that's the concept that you need to express from your table of contents image. And if it's attractive, that shows that you care about your work. And I know that may sound superficial. You should say, well, my work will speak for itself. Well, that's true once the potential reader has clicked on it and read it. Okay, so if it's attractive, it shows that you care about your work. And if you care about your work, then there's a greater chance that I'm going to believe that you cared about how you executed your work and about your quality of science and the reliability of your data. They are connected. Humans are built that way, remember. So 4 tests for your table of contents image. And the very simplest one, the most obvious one, the first one, does it have the following dimensions? And so it needs to be these dimensions. Now, I know this is a very high level of precision, so I'm sorry it came out of the imperial system. 8.47 centimeters wide and 4.76 centimeters high. Okay, so let's just say we'll go slightly smaller, 8.4 centimeters wide and 4.7 centimeters high. It has to be landscape. And the reason why it has to be landscape, as you can see, is that, so here's a table of contents image from our latest issue of Chemistry Materials. And so this clearly fits within these dimensions and has landscape. It's wider than it is high. Now, if you were to submit to us a table of contents image that is portrait, that is more vertically oriented as opposed to landscape, it's going to get squeezed down this way. It's going to end up like this because it has to fit within those dimensions. So even if you've rotated, it has the right dimensions, but it's rotated 90 degrees, it's going to get squeezed and it's going to get small and it's going to be difficult to read. And if it's difficult to read, your reader then has to squint and spend time. You may lose potential downloads. You may lose readers. Okay, so look at this again. This is the original table of contents image, and it certainly is a lot nicer to read than this tiny little thing. So please just simply make it landscape right from the very beginning. So the next test for your table of contents image, is it crammed with too much information? And we see this all the time, is that people say, well, there's so much in my paper, how do I pick? And so they put everything in there. And I understand the temptation for doing that. I really do understand those to doing that. So what you need to do is go back and consider your paper and say, what is the core lesson? What is the core message? What is the most important thing? And choose that and focus on that. Focus on that one issue. Okay, because if it's crammed with too much information, it suggests that maybe your paper is lacking focus. And that may be unfair because your paper may have a perfect, beautiful focus. But again, that table of contents image can lead to the wrong impression. But more importantly is that if it's crammed with too much information, it's just impossible to read. My 100 milliseconds that I'm spending looking at that table of contents image and choosing papers from a whole bunch of papers, if it's impossible to read or understand quickly, I may miss the point. And then that's sad. If the font is too small, I can't read it. And the reader maybe cannot tell what the paper's about. And again, the way we are built, messy figures suggest a disorganized paper. And you don't want to ever give that impression. After all those years or months of work, you don't want to give that impression. Please don't lead potential readers down that path. Okay, the third test for your table of contents image. Did you use Helvetica and Arial font consistently? And this we see all the time. So ACS and many other major publishing houses, they strongly suggest using Helvetica font, and Arial is a similar one. And the reason is that Helvetica was designed for graphics. Helvetica looks very clean. A Times font was meant for written text. It does not look good in graphics. We see it all the time, but we're saying, no, we think that you should use Helvetica. And I know this may sound very superficial, but it just makes your figures look cleaner when you're using Helvetica font. And so another thing that we see is we often see within figures or within figures within a paper, multiple fonts. That means there's Helvetica mixed with Cambria, mixed with Times, and this just looks inconsistent. It looks messy and doesn't look clean. And all these things then go back to, do those authors really care about their science? And if they don't care about their science, well, should I trust their data? Should I spend my precious time reading that paper? You don't want to give people that impression. Okay, so multiple fonts and different size fonts in a figure look very messy. And please always ensure that your text is large enough to be legible and clear. Okay, so very simple. Just use Helvetica font and then no questions. Okay, the last thing, the last test for your table of contents image. Did you come up with a new table of contents image, or did you just copy a figure from the paper? Figure papers typically just don't work as table of contents images because their purpose was to present data. So data within a context, data that is complemented by text that the reader will be reading and gives them the background to understanding that figure. It does not really, they do not tend to stand alone. So for instance here, this is just a plot, and we see this often, is that people will just simply take a figure or something or a plot from their paper and plunk it in as their table of contents image. But again, it tends to be too specialized to understand quickly. In 100 milliseconds, I can't grasp even what this is, what type of spectroscopy this is, let alone to be able to understand what it even means. Within this figure, there's way too much text. It's not aesthetically attractive, and I just don't understand what the story is about, what that paper is about. So please take the time to tell the story with your table of contents image, the focus of your story, and it really will pay for itself. This is time well spent. You will get more downloads, more readers, and more citations. And the point of all this time we spend in science is to have an impact on science, because we want people to read our work. I mean, that's the point of publishing. So the table of contents image can play a very important role in that, and please don't overlook that. I know it can sound superficial, but it's so important, so critical. So the next part is just to talk about the longevity, or maximizing the longevity of your research. So Brian Korgel from UT Austin, so he's an associate editor with Chemistry Materials. He and I wrote this editorial called The Experimental Section, which is the key to longevity of your research. And the key point of your experimental section in your paper is teaching people to do what you do. And so while citations are important or critical, it's about, in essence, really what you're doing is how many people you have taught and now do what you do. You want people to follow up on your research and to follow up on it successfully. Because if you are 0.0 and in terms of a research area or a discovery that then grows exponentially into a whole field, isn't that fabulous? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that what you want? So if people can reproduce your work, then wow, you could spawn a whole new area. If people can't reproduce your area or your research, well, you're just going to lead to some frustrated people. And eventually people may say, you know, I just am not going to try and reproduce work of Professor X anymore because I could never get it to work. That's a terrible thing. So your experimental section is really, really important. And so what you need to do is provide as much detail as is feasible. Please put yourself in the shoes of a new student. So a new student who's getting in the lab, who may not be so familiar with the subtleties and intricacies of the research. What you see as obvious may not be so obvious to someone who's new. So could this person reproduce your work? And some things that you can do in addition to text is you use the supplementary information. So use the supplementary materials to provide extra details, because time and space is limited in an actual text part of the paper. So feel free to use the SI to put in as many extra details as you want. Put in a photograph of the apparatus you're using. So we find that oftentimes if you put in a photo, that a photograph again can speak 1,000 words. And instead of describing it in detail, and oftentimes it becomes very technical, is a simple photograph says, oh, okay, that's how it's done. Movies, feel free to upload those. Those can be put into the SI. Again, details that you think are obvious may not be so evident. So try to capture as many as possible. And if a movie does it, great. And lastly, and I know this may sound really negative, but we hear about this, please do not withhold details intentionally, because irreproducible papers can cause enormous undocumented harm, mostly to the young scientists who are getting into the lab and trying to reproduce a paper because they were interested in your work. So if you withhold details intentionally or even unintentionally, then people may have trouble reproducing them. Young scientists may spend 6 months. They'll go back to their boss and say, their supervisor, I can't reproduce this. They say, well, keep trying. And all of a sudden, 6 months of frustration, maybe people will leave science. And that really is a tragedy. So again, please put in as many details as possible. Because on the good side is that if more people work on it, then your research becomes higher impact. Okay, so some common graphical errors and how to correct them. There's a very beautiful editorial written by Prashant Kamat, Gregory Hartland, and George Schatz of Journal of Physical Chemistry. And so this is a quote from this editorial on graphical excellence. A little extra care in presentation of the data can increase the impact of your published work. So a little extra care, kind of like the table of contents image, simply finishing and beautifying that your graphics, your figures, can help your reader understand them more easily. And if they understand your work more easily, it has a greater impact. People will remember. So we often wonder when we see papers about researchers who really truly are passionate about communicating their research findings, and yet maybe they don't present their work well. And you think, boy, all that care and love of their research, which simply doesn't get expressed through their data, simply because they didn't take the time to just make the figures clear, make the figures clean. We're not talking works of art. We're just talking about something that is visually clean and clear and easy to understand. This is your work. This is your chance to express your results and your thoughts to the world. So please take the time and do it well. We're not talking works of art. We're just talking, think about layout, think about structure. So this is a figure from that editorial from Graphical Excellence. So here we are talking with some hardcore spectroscopic data. But you can see here that in terms of graphical excellence, this is a figure that contains some very technical, specialized data, but it's very clear. It's not crowded. The font sizes are very legible, and the authors have used color in a very helpful way. So everything is easy to read. So they've got legends that help to identify what each of the traces correspond to. They have bold axis lines, and so sometimes we see that that the graph or the plot itself is too faint to see. You can barely even see the box. You can easily see the tick marks on the y and x axes. The analyzed data is in an inset, but it's not too small to read. Sometimes we see insets that are teeny tiny, and you're squinting, and it's frustrating. The colors are very vibrant, and so this is just a very clean figure that I can go in and understand and be quite happy with, and not end up frustrated. And that's what you want. You want your science is hard enough. Please don't make it harder. So the second to last thing is how to decide what citations to include. And so another very nice editorial by Prashant Kamat and George Schatz of Journal of Physical Chemistry is Cite with a Cite. And so this is an interesting editorial that tries to provide some advice on how to choose which citations you should pick. And this is important because oftentimes papers have, or different journals will have citation limits. They may say, oh, you can only have 30 references in a manuscript, or 70. And so 70 sounds like a lot, but it's actually very surprising. Suddenly you can be at 100 and you say, oh my goodness, I have to remove 30. How do I do that? So you have to choose this very carefully. And so even if you don't have a limit, it's very important that you think about each citation carefully. So you want to choose a well-balanced mix of citations. So you want citations that provide good background, So citations that justify why you're doing your science, so that they will provide background into the scientific issues that you are tackling. They'll also provide details that will support your choice of model or your experimental approach. And to just go a little further is that they will also help you map out the scope of your work. And so the scope of the publications you are citing also kind of lay the groundwork as to the area. Now here's something that may seem a little obvious, but I think needs to be said, is that please read the citations you are citing. It's so easy now with EndNote and with Zotero to simply press click and download the citation in the exact citation format that you need for the paper, and there it is, all beautifully done. I don't even need to read it. But what we see very often, and what reviewers often point out, is that people will end up clicking and including references that have little relevance. And so we see this all the time in reviews saying, I went to reference 67 and it had nothing to do with what it was supposed to have to do with. And so please read your citation. And be sure to cite the paper correctly. So Web of Science, for instance, does not correct incorrect citations. And so that's a problem. Please do not overly cite yourself. You do need to self-cite. I mean, you need to cite your earlier work, and because that provides context as to what you did before and what you're building on. But please don't go to town. So 20% is kind of an upper max, but please don't go more than that. Again, a balance of citations is important. So you want a good blend of old and new. It's always nice to go back to the original citations, to the very beginning. But you don't want to have only old citations, because then it suggests that what you're working on is kind of dated. So you also want to have new ones. And please choose accessible references, i.e. if you cite unpublished work or transitory websites, they may not even exist, and how do I follow up on unpublished work? That's not very helpful to me. So choose concrete citations. So to conclude, before we get to the question section, so remember, after all the hard work in the lab, and I really mean it, the blood, sweat, and the tears, everything that's gone into that research, and you've written your draft, and you now have your story, the story that you're going to tell, please ensure a clear and clean presentation of your research results. Again, if you show that you care about your research, it comes out in the presentation. If it looks like you don't care, people may assume that you didn't care about the execution of your work, and then they start to question whether or not they should believe your data. And you don't want anyone to think that. Clean figures, just the corollary. Clean figures and well thought out writing suggest clean and well executed science. Okay, the opposite may suggest unreliable work. Again, you don't want to lead your readers down that path. And lastly, again, put yourself in the place of a busy reviewer and reader who've got 5,000 things they have to do, and they're kind of going, oh, I'm really stressed out. Is if you can make it clear and make it obvious and express it in a way that's readily understandable, and we're talking very complicated science generally. It's hard enough. Science is hard. Please don't make it harder. So clarity and structure can equal a grateful and happy reviewer. And a grateful, happy reviewer tends to lead to papers that are accepted. And happy reviewers means happy readers, which can lead to lots of citations and high impact. Okay, so a lack thereof, clarity and structure, can lead to frustrated and unhappy reviewers. And unhappy reviewers equals, and I put there ... You can fill in the blank. Maybe your paper's declined. Okay, and that you don't want. And wouldn't that be sad that all that work was declined because your work wasn't presented properly? Okay, so part 3 of this series is going to take place, it's going to be a webinar as well, but it's going to take place live in the ACS meeting in Denver. That's going to be on Monday, March 23rd, 12 to 1 p.m. in Mountain Time. So the question that's going to be asked of these 5 editors is, my most memorable authoring experience. Because remember, at ACS, we're all authors too, and so we all change our hats. So we live this in the same way that you do. We are also authors. We also submit our papers. So we know what it's like, because that is what we do every day. So there's going to be 5 editors who are going to be there. So Prashant Kamat, me, George Schatz, who's Prashant and George are from Journal of Physical Chemistry. Paul Weiss is ACS Nano, and Carolyn Bertozzi from ACS's new journal, ACS Central Science. So I want to thank you very much for listening to me drone on, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much. I'm just going to look at the questions. So I see, so these are the questions that are coming to me. First question says, a reviewer recommended that I delete all the citations before 2008. I don't agree with this. What do you think? I agree. I think that sounds awful. I mean, I was doing research before 2008, not being a spring chicken. So I definitely don't agree with that at all. Perhaps what they were, I don't even know what they were saying. So I think you have to choose papers that are relevant. I think it's very important to go back to the original citations because oftentimes citations will end up perpetuated. So maybe even citations that didn't really say what people think they said. People say, well, so-and-so cited, and then someone cites that, and so-and-so cited, and so-and-so cited, and down the line. But maybe that original citation didn't actually say that. I think it's very important to go back to the original citations, and so choose what you think is right. And simply because a reviewer says, I don't think you should do that, doesn't mean you have to. Simply respond with a balanced response to the editor, saying, I don't think that's right because I think that these citations should be cited. I think they're important, and I'm going to keep them. So, and they say, okay, fine. Okay, I have another question on what is the policy on reusing table of contents figures, for example, in print and digital promotion of a paper? Can my institution press office post the figure in print materials on social media? Okay, that's an excellent question. So normally when people are reusing images, if these are going to be printed, what you can do is, I'm assuming that the table of contents image would be covered under the copyright, but this is very simple to do, is that you would go to the original, go back to the publication, and you can go to the rights link, and you can go and request that this be reused. Generally it's free of charge, and so you just simply get permissions. You get it right away. It's immediate. It's easy. So I would do that. So go to rights link, just click that, go to the paper, you can say copyright, and then you just click in, just add a bit of information. You're from a university, perhaps a nonprofit, and it will give you permission immediately. It'll even generate the certificate. So I would just do that. Okay, I hope that I answered that question. Here's a question. Is there a minimum number of citations required for a full paper? Isn't that an interesting question? The answer is no. There is not a minimum number of citations required for a full paper, but I would say that there is a minimum number of citations required to get that paper accepted, and every paper or every submission is going to have a different number of citations that are required. You really have to be sure that you cite the people who worked before you. Again, you're standing on the shoulder of giants. You didn't just, none of us came up with our science. I mean, we don't live in a crystal box, so we didn't come up with our science completely by ourselves. I mean, we're basing our science on people who worked on that area before us. I mean, all of us. So you want to make sure that you reflect that you capture that. You really have to. You want to make sure that you are being fair, because you want people to be fair to you. You don't want to be excluded, and none of us like that when people publish something in a closely related area and then they don't cite us. You kind of think, how did they miss me? That doesn't seem right. So be very careful. I would say to err on the side of being generous, to cite more people than, you don't want to go crazy, but you want to capture as many people as is feasible. How about we say that? Okay, so I'm just looking through a whole list of questions here. Here's a question. Most of the time, reviewers ask you to remove the details from the experimental section. Well, I wouldn't say most of the time reviewers ask you to remove details from the experimental section, but I would move them into if you are asked. So there's two reasons why you might be asked. Is that one, maybe you've already published a paper and you've already outlined the experimental details. There's no reason to have to publish the identical process again. You could simply cite that earlier paper. So maybe reviewers are asking you to simply cite the earlier methods that you already published. But I would always put them into the SI. So if you think that you, as the author, say, my readers need to be able to read this in order to reproduce it. And if that's true, then put it in the SI. Okay, you know, this is your paper. The reviewers really are making a suggestion. And so if those details are important for the reproducibility of the paper, you need to keep them in. Putting them in the SI is absolutely fine as long as they are available. Okay, so I would just do that. Okay, here's a question. I often use Microsoft Excel for my graphs and charts. Which other tools and software do you recommend for my data? Oh boy, I wish my graduate students were here because they use a whole series of things. How about you email me offline and I will get back to you, because there's a number of actually free applications that we use in order to do that. So I'm not being very helpful. I'm just answering the questions as I see them. Here's one. With respect to the citations, if the research area is really narrow, evidently the citation cannot compare with other research areas. How can one build a good evaluation system for the published paper? Okay, so what you're saying is that if your research area is really narrow, how do you generate a citation, a group of citations or references for that? Well, research areas, I'm finding that most research areas really are not that narrow. I mean, some areas are. So some areas that are narrow, for instance, include materials that are used in nuclear reactors or highly radioactive materials that can only be done in national labs. These are areas that are very narrow simply because the number of people who can actually work with these things is really small. There are very few areas like that. But I think that I can say just do your best. Just do your best. Err on the side of generosity in terms of, remember, standing on the shoulder of giants. Think about related areas that may have been useful, and if just try to do it right. But err on the side of generosity is what I'm thinking, because we're always incorporating unconsciously data and paper, results of papers all around us, and oftentimes we don't register that, but really they were important. So try to sit back and think about it. And I know that may not be the best and clearest answer, but just do your best, and again, err on the side of generosity. So here's one. So what if we want to import a lot of information in one table? So a lot of times we do see very big tables, and they get published. So it depends what you mean by a lot of information. So you need to ask yourself, how much information do I need to include in the main text to make the point, to substantiate my claims? If you have a huge amount of information that really is not, that you can put in the supplementary materials to which the reader can refer, then that's another option. Again, the main text is meant to be the core data. We see supplementary material sections that are 100 pages long. And that's absolutely fine. So supplementary materials sections of 10 to 20 pages are pretty common. So if you don't need all that data in your main text, put it in the SI. Just put the representative data in the main text. Enough that the reader can say, well, yeah, okay, I see. And then if there's more, they can refer to the SI. Okay, boy, the questions are coming in really fast. Okay, here's one. We are constantly told not to judge a book by its cover, and then the journal expects us to produce an attractive graphic for TOC. Isn't it reinforcing just what we are told not to emphasize? Yes, it does. So We're told not to judge a book by its cover, but at the same time, remember, going back to the image of us being, we're all busy, and so an attractive table of contents image, which may really, you can do in 15, 30 minutes, okay? It doesn't have to be a work of art. Simply has to be thoughtful. It can lead to more people reading your paper, more people downloading your paper, more people citing your paper. We can't change humanity. This is the way we're built. And so you simply taking the extra time, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it takes to make that image attractive, to show what your paper is about, is worth it. Okay? So if it's a sloppy image, I may send you back. So I go through, we get 5,000 submissions a year. I go through every table of contents image when they come in, and I flag them if they're, I just write a little note to the associate editors, this table of contents image just isn't that great, because I'm not doing it to be harsh, I'm doing it to be helpful. I want your papers to be cited. I want your papers to be downloaded. And so I'm doing this to actually be helpful. Okay. Questions? Some journals are focusing on the impact of the papers. Even the authors do their work very carefully and beautifully. Do you think journals are commercialized? Isn't that a good question? I think that's a very interesting question, and I'm really thankful to the person who asked that question. Do I think journals are commercialized? I actually think that American Chemical Society journals, and I'm going to sound very biased, but ACS journals to me are not commercialized, because all of us, we are all authors. All of us, we are all researchers. And so by definition, we are in the community ourselves. And so we are there in the labs. We are writing our own papers as well. And so we are evaluating from that sense. We see papers all the time as editors, as reviewers, and we're looking for good science. For me, good science matters the most. There are certainly journals that are commercialized. Absolutely, there are. And the idea is to make profit. The idea is to sell copies. I don't see it that way with my journal. I don't see that with any of the American Chemical Society journals, is that we are all authors. We are all academics or industry researchers, all of us. And so quality of science matters most. It really does. And I truly believe that. So, good question. Okay, so I'm getting a question about, is there a problem with the sound signal? I hope not. Okay, should we use, sorry, so many questions. How to approach an interesting topic lacking consolidated specific journals. Okay, so what you're saying is that how do I publish a paper in an area that is lacking a very specific journal? Well, luckily there's so many multidisciplinary journals out there. So many journals are becoming interdisciplinary. So in American Chemical Society, we have many multidisciplinary journals. And chemistry materials, we're very broad, ACS Nano, JACS, of course, the Journal of Physical Chemistry journals. I mean, we're all very broad. So what you should do is scan table of contents images, go through papers of different journals, and go with your gut instinct. Decide, this is where my paper will be at home. So they'll be at home in this particular journal. It makes sense. I feel comfortable there. I think this manuscript will be comfortable there. I see a question, what is SI? Okay, so SI is the supplementary information. If you go to most publishing houses, certainly American Chemical Society, you'll see the publication, the actual manuscript, and you see the supplementary information. And if you click on that, you'll see an extra file that was prepared by the authors that contains extra information. Maybe it contains other spectroscopic data, additional experimental details, other things that the authors thought were useful, but really didn't belong in the main text. a lot of this is meant to be very helpful for future readers, for future people who are trying to reproduce the results. So it's an extra file that is there. It's part of the paper. It's considered part of the publication. It's generally free to download, and you can just go and see what's there. And so most papers nowadays have an SI, a supplementary information, or supplementary materials, depending on what you want to call it. Okay, so what can we do if our results are not as common as expected? We have to publish them to tell others not to do our work again. It won't work as you expect. However, all journals search for outstanding results and may not publish our work. Okay, that's a good question. So you have discovered something that is, I don't want to use the term negative results, but some people do. So your results are not as common as expected. It's not a, wow, we got a 20% efficiency solar cell. It's not a, if the science is interesting, it will be published. And so, for instance, we have a paper that's coming out. It shows that some previous interpretations on a particular material were wrong, and in fact, that this material is not as great as people thought for this particular application. But the important thing that they did is they said, and here's why. And then they walked us through their analyses and their interesting science, and there was a good story. So negative results can be published. It all comes down to the story. If the science itself is interesting, and if the results are important to the field, it will get published, and we do publish these. So again, because we ourselves are researchers, and I'd like to know if this actually is not going to work as well as we think. So, okay, here's a good question. These are all good questions. The number of journals is exploding. Why are publishers continuing to subdivide journal topics into finer and finer areas of research just to increase revenue? Well, there's another thing that's happening is that the number of papers that are being submitted is increasing so much. I mean, it really, the pressure, the submission pressure is becoming really high. So a lot of the new areas or new journal publications that are coming out oftentimes are just the result of enormous pressure. We can only publish so many. So I'm not saying that what you're asking is completely off base, but submission pressure it really is heavy. So I think that there is a need for new journals simply because of that. Okay, so I'm just going through so many questions. If my research area is very broad, there are too many related choices for citation. How to make the best citation? Ooh, this happens a lot. So your research area, you're working on something that perhaps is very interdisciplinary. There's a lot of groups around the world working in it. How do you pick? Well, you're going to have to pick something because you can't go in and you may be bumping up against a citation limit, or you just simply can't cite everybody. You're going to just have to do your best. You're going to have to go with your gut instinct. One thing that can be helpful is to cite reviews. And I don't say I'm not an advocate of only citing reviews, because I think that's a bit narrow in terms of thinking. But reviews can help to capture some of the area. So you're just going to have to go and pick recent papers that are closest to you, some of the original papers that really enabled you to do or have started the area or enabled you to do what you wanted to do. You're going to have to just think about each paper, at least have read the papers, and then it may become more obvious. It's a tough one. I admit it's difficult. Here's one. What is the appropriate strategy to write a good review article in an organized manner? So to avoid killing time, I guess that means wasting time in
Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our webinar series, Mastering the Arts of Scientific Publication. I'm Carlos Toro. I'm the managing editor of two ACS publications, Chemistry of Materials and ACS Photonics. And we are delighted that you can join us today for this part two of this webinar series. If you joined us for part one, welcome again. If you are tuning for the first time, then I would like to remind you that part one of this webinar series was about a couple of weeks ago, where Professor Prashant Kamath, deputy editor of Journal of Physical Chemistry Letter, covered some of the most basic items when it comes to preparing a manuscript for publication, how to really convey your story in a concise way and that is appealing for a broad audience. Today, Professor Jillian Buriak is going to cover a different aspect of preparing a manuscript for publication. She's going to focus on how to make your paper look appealing, how to prepare an effective table of content image, how to make your figures appealing. But before we jump right into the webinar, I would like to go through some of the housekeeping items. So by now, if you have logged into the webcast site, you should be seeing at the bottom of your screen 5 widgets. The one to your left, the yellow one, is the slide area. So pretty much you can toggle on and off the slides that Jillian is going to be using today throughout her presentation. The second widget is the Q&A widget. So that's where you would be able to submit your questions throughout the presentation. And also, if you have any technical problem, our team will be able to assist you. The third widget is the speaker information. And so today our speaker is, as I mentioned, Professor Jillian Buriak. She's the Canada Research Chair of Nanotechnology. She's the Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry of Materials. And you can see the information there. Her research interests span over a wide variety of fields, with particular emphasis in nanotechnology applications for new materials and interfaces. The fourth widget is content that is available to you throughout this webinar. What I would like to remind you of is that if by any chance you would like to get access to the journal portfolio of ACS, we are providing you with a promo code that you can use to access these articles for free within the next 15 days. Also, it is important to remind you that this webinar series has been put together as a follow-up of a virtual issue that came out late last year, covering most of tips from editors on how to improve and how to make your article effective. All the virtual issue, it's called Mastering the Science of Scientific Publication. It has 20 editorials. All of those are available for free. And also I would like to bring to your attention that ACS CanWork is the platform that ACS is using to handle part of the manuscript workflow, but at the same time, ACS CanWorks offer our authors an English editing service. For those of you that are joining us from abroad and outside US, ACS is delighted to offer this service to our authors. And the last widget, it's a help page, and throughout the presentation you can find quick answers to any problem that you can experience throughout the webinar. It is important to remind you that this webinar today, part 2, and the whole series is brought to you by the Publications Division of the American Chemical Society, as well as ACS can work. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Jillian Buriak, Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry of Materials. And again, she will be covering important topics that usually